Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Film Score Podcast. Today, my guest is Ariel Marx. I was actually really excited for this interview, and it was one that I'd been hoping could happen for quite a while. I first heard Ariel's score for Shiva Baby earlier this year, I think in April, and it really blew me away. Even though it's not a horror movie necessarily, it really made me feel sick and anxious and tense, all the things that a great horror score would do. So it easily became one of my favorites of the year. So then to have a chance to talk with Ariel was just really great. Not only do we cover Shiva Baby, we talk about some of her other works as well, including her recent contribution to the anthology American Horror Stories. And then, of course, on top of that, we just broadly talk about her work, some of her interests in film and film music, and, well, by now you know the deal. And you can find more about Ariel on her website and find her on social media. And she seems to have a steady stream of scores and solo output coming out, so always keep your ears open. And of course, for me, you can always find me on social media as well, and keep a lookout on my website for more and more interviews and other write-ups. I've recently gotten a couple guest contributors to write a few things, so that's been really exciting, and I'm always looking for more. And if you keep your eyes open, you might see me make my first guest appearance on another film music podcast. More information on that to come. But in the meantime, sit back and I hope you enjoy. Ariel, I'm so glad you're able to join me today. How have you been?
I've been really great. Yeah, I've been actually enjoying the heat. It's been nice. How about you?
I'm doing well too. I would say I'm not enjoying the heat, but
yeah, it just is an excuse to go other places, I think. So that's see cooler places. So that's what I mean.
I figured for you, you just throw the air conditioning on and it gives you an excuse to stay in, record, and write music all day.
Well, yes. The AC would be hard though to record around. So, it's good to have a work-life balance.
It's true. I mean, and I know that you have like a lot of stuff coming out or that's come out. So how do you actually maintain that balance? Because I think it can be easy for a composer to basically work from dawn till dusk every day of the week.
Yeah, I mean, it's always, I think every composer or every artist is trying to is struggling with that to some extent. I do work really, really long hours and I'm just used to it, but your body kind of tells you and your mind kind of tells you when you need a break. So I am mostly a workaholic, but when I do feel like, okay, very simple tasks are harder or just, something's not coming to me quickly, it's really good to just take a break and come back, and then you're just refreshed and more creative after that. So that I've found to kind of listen to that when I absolutely have to.
So what are some of the things that you do to get refreshed? Is it anything, I know some people, they'll have a solo career, for instance, and they jump to that and it at least gives them a break from the film music. Is that
Sure.
something similar for you? Because I know that you actually released an EP.
Yeah.
So is that similar, or, is it sometimes just getting the hell out and doing something different?
Well, I think it's two things. So if creatively you're feeling stuck, yes, absolutely. That's a great trick, is to kind of shift gears and go into either a different project or something for yourself completely unrelated to film. And so for sure, that has been, when I wrote that album, it was highly necessary for me to kind of split up my other projects and put all my effort into something that was, totally differently inspired. And then I really love a good hike or a good swim or something to just remind get out of your bubble and your work for just a little bit and to orient yourself in the rest of the world and then come back, and it works a lot faster. Or being creative in other ways. For instance, I have a side hobby of doing pottery. And so I really love still being creative, but not necessarily, and listening to music and learning continually. I just think it's good to kind of step outside every once in a while.
You mentioned that you listen to music as some of the time off that you have. What are some of the things that you listen to? Are they ever film related, or is it totally different as well?
Yeah, I mean, some of my go-tos to just reorient myself in what I love is Chopin, Stravinsky, Ravel. I really love Johnny Greenwood's work in music, and Mika Levy and Elmer Bernstein and Ennio Morricone. And then it's nice to, Nico Case, I love as a singer. I draw inspiration from everywhere. So yes, I love to immerse myself in the film music world, but it's also important to kind of remove yourself from it, because we make certain choices based on film narrative, and it's really important to think about just music alone sometimes. So it's helpful to listen to all of it.
Yeah, I bet. So I guess would that be kind of how you describe some of your inspirations or some of the things that got you on this path into becoming a film and media composer with just like this big assortment of music from basically across the centuries?
Well, yes, but I would also say my biggest inspiration for getting into this is just my craving for collaboration. My first instinct as a musician was never to be a solo artist. It was always to collaborate with others, either like being in a group ensemble setting or being a composer and writing for other people. But mainly, I felt kind of the loneliness as a composer, just writing for writing's sake. And I loved working with a collaborator in some way. So early collaborations were even with myself, with my own artwork, just creating a soundtrack for a drawing or a shadow box or an animation that I made, or like early on. And then I realized how much I loved the music being led by some sort of narrative or storytelling. And so it just kind of blossomed from there. But yeah, it was really just this hunger of wanting to have the music be part of something bigger and not just for listening. So, museum exhibits and dances and environments and all, there's all these things that I explored before I really narrowed into film scoring. And it's just, I think the greatest joy is just feeling like you're contributing to something greater than your own thoughts, your own mind. And it's so rewarding being part of a creative team, because you really do become like family. You're all pushing, all ushering this baby out into the world, and that kind of shared sense of commitment is really lovely.
That's so cool. I think that's obviously the idea of film music and really any aspect of working in film is collaborative. That's just inherent to it. But I don't know if I've ever talked with anyone who's said that the naturally collaborative aspect is one of the reasons they got into it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's and some of my closest friends are people that I've worked with professionally, and it's just such a special privilege just working so intensely with creative minds. So yeah, that is for sure the first instinct. But it was a really great exercise for me to then go away and write my own work, something from my own heart. And that was also very unnatural to me at first, is because usually I'm influenced by, like principal photography of the film, or even shots of the film, or a script from a film. But for this, it was just kind of the concept of the album inspiring me, and that came from me too. So it's a bit more vulnerable, just producing something on your own. And so that was a really great exercise too, which I really want to do again soon when I have a breather. So yeah, I think it's really lovely when composers can balance both of those aspects of their lives. And I do find, like, everyone who has put out their own solo work, ultimately they get work because of that solo work. It's another aspect of yourself you're showing that you'd love to be paid attention to, and so therefore the next gig can come from that solo album. And that already happened with me.
Really?
For Rebel Hearts, the documentary that I did that went to Sundance last year, my solo album was what kind of grabbed the ear of the director, and so it felt good that it was kind of already working for itself in the way that I had hoped.
See, that's super cool because obviously, like from the listener perspective, you have no idea how a composer is getting their gigs, how the next one comes in. So first off, it's awesome to hear that being able to show another side of yourself lends yourself to more jobs. I mean, it makes sense. I think it's also really fun hearing those and actually being able to, like, if you followed a composer for a little while or heard a lot of their film work alone, and then you hear that and it's like, oh, I didn't even know that this is something that they did or something that they were capable of. I think Danny Elfman had released, maybe it was music for a ballet a couple years ago, like 3-4 years ago, and I listened to that and I was like, oh, I didn't know he did this. And it's just like, it's just so fun.
Yeah, exactly. And I think most of us just end up following a certain path that, just kind of builds on itself. Like we become known for certain palettes or aesthetics or directions, and hopefully it's something you very much love. And in my case, I definitely have loved kind of the directions that I keep being asked to produce in. But it is a way to just say, hey, that's not everything I do. And or even to say to yourself, hey, that's not everything I can do. And to challenge yourself to write something completely different. So yeah, it's just muscle building and, experiments with yourself as well.
I will say, talking about your sound, like the directions that you often go in, I do really enjoy how a lot of your scores feel very organic and authentic. Like they don't sound like they're created from a sample library. That's something that I've appreciated, I think, since the first work of yours I heard, which was Shiva Baby earlier this year, 6 months ago or so.
Yeah, even I'm getting my I'm getting my years mixed up too. Yeah, I believe it was in April. But then, we were due to premiere at South by like 2020. And so it's been a long all of these past 3 years have kind of blended into each other, but yeah, that was I really 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 value live recording when it's necessary or when it's asked for, and when you're working with in the electronic sphere, that's less of a need. But I always find, whether it's myself on the recording or any other friend or colleague, or I'm working with a larger ensemble, you just cannot beat the effect of having human performance on it. And I just crave it so much, and I really never feel samples pass in my book for what I'm trying to do. And I think sometimes you can endanger your creativity because they are limited in techniques. And so it's important to remember that when you are with a live musician, they don't just have to play what you wrote. They don't necessarily have to play what your sample libraries can do. So to always remember that there's this larger world of techniques and expression that are beyond sample libraries. So I think that's where most of the, at least that I appreciate, the most of the magic of scores that I love come in, from the human expression.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that that's probably the biggest complaint people broadly have about them. But I do appreciate that a lot of the time with time and budget constraints, sometimes they're necessary. And so, I mean, with those in mind, how are you able to consistently have live players or live recordings? Is that something that you'll typically do only when the direction of the narrative calls for it, or is that something that whenever possible you'll try to get in to have that sense of authenticity and magic that comes in from it?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, when it doesn't call for it, I would never push a player on something that didn't need it. But, if the budget is teeny tiny, I still find ways to, I'll have a soloist or have a single musician coming and adding color to it, or even myself. It just changes everything. It changes the ideas that you come up with. And especially if you bring a musician on, either yourself or someone else, early on in the project, certain performances can inform certain cues and therefore kind of lead you in a different direction. It's definitely mythical, these budgets that kind of used to be ubiquitous, where orchestral recordings were very, very easy to come by because budgets have shrunk. And especially in the indie world, I think it pushes you to be a little bit more creative in terms of getting that same sound but with a different approach. And so how can you sound big without having the resources you traditionally would need? That lends itself to experimenting with different techniques of recording and layering and arranging, and different insights that sometimes a solo instrument can sound larger than an orchestra with a certain type of performance or emotional expression to it. So I think budget wise, being forced to think of things kind of a little bit non-traditionally, I think has been really valuable, and that you can know that you can get quite a large sound without an enormous amount of money, which is what I think most of us are grappling it with, at least for some of our gigs.
Is that a side of composing that you enjoy, or is it more of an obstacle that you have to get over?
Well, it's both. I think if, for instance, the tempo and the direction of the film is very, very, does that have that large orchestral symphonic sound, and you don't have the budget to make it that way, but that really is the vision and direction of the film, then that can become a little bit more of an obstacle, but also a challenge. And oftentimes I'll always bring in a quartet and layer them on top of samples to have the grain of human expression, but also have the width and the volume of samples. And I you kind of I've learned over the years how to combine those in a really successful way. But I think it's always exciting. Like, parameters are always where you find really interesting and unique solutions. I'm kind of just used to it at this point. Like, I know it's not going to be what potentially it needs to be. And so it's always about finding the magic solutions and kind of smoke and mirrors of it all.
That does make sense. And I think, especially now, it being so known that you're typically not going to have that massive budget, that it isn't a surprise getting into composing for film or TV and realizing you have to do these creative solutions. So it makes sense, and I think it ties into what you said earlier of the parameters forcing you to get even more creative.
Yeah, I think so. And when you're writing for an orchestra, there's certain, because it's such an old tradition and an ensemble, a tried and true ensemble, there's so many, we know exactly how to write for it and it'll sound beautiful. But when you have a smaller ensemble or a set of instruments that you are not as familiar with as an ensemble together, it just does force you to make arrangement decisions and compositional decisions that are just a little bit less straightforward, which I think is where some of that, that playfulness and adventurism can come out.
That kind of makes you wonder if that's one of the reasons why you so often get these really strange or creative scores coming out of smaller indie projects because of that need to find a solution to having a short timeline and not having a lot of money.
I mean, I think that is part of it, and then certain narratives are calling for, like Shiva Baby. When I was working on Shiva Baby, there was no temp on it, and Emma knew she wanted a klezmer inspired score. She also knew she wanted tension, but there wasn't a comp for it that she knew of, and or that the editor had worked with, and so that was clearly a film that could take very, very, very little melody. It was all texture and all tension and layering of extended techniques. And so in that instance, we would never have wanted or used a traditionally larger ensemble. The intensity of that score came from it being one or two instruments layered and layered and layered. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of budget constraints, but then also they are therefore unique, and then therefore that becomes what is wanted. So it's all kind of a snake eating its own tail kind of thing, and it's always really exciting to hear something new and unexpected. But it's also refreshing to hear more traditional approaches too. Both are enjoyable, and I'm glad they still exist in our scoring landscape.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it seems like a paradox to say, but if every score was getting unexpected and experimental, suddenly that would kind of make none of them like that. So it's nice having that balance of more traditional scores and orchestral scoring. And I know a lot of people wish that there was more of that, but like we've been talking about the issues about that. So yeah, I love having that balance too. But I'm glad you mentioned Shiva Baby, because that's a score that I had heard it probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 months before I ended up seeing the film, and like your score actually put me off watching it for a little while. Because I listened to it, and I think it's like 22 minutes or something, and I'm so glad it's that short, because it's just like being anxious for 22 minutes straight.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't even know if I can watch this movie, because God, if it's anything like this, I'm just gonna be curled up. And luckily, it is an awkward, tense, anxious film that, like you're saying, using one or two instruments really mirrors that intimacy and intensity.
Right.
But I was able to get through it, and like I really enjoyed it, both the film and the score. So that very much made me happy.
Yeah, well, and I think why the score worked so well in that film is that it was of a singular point of view, but the film, it is not a horror thriller. It has certain elements of that, but it's such a comedy as well. And I think the juxtaposition of the score and it being so narrow-minded in its approach, tonally at least, on its own, I can completely see why you reacted that way. But in the placed together with the film, there is a balance of comedy and of horror, and the horror of being with one's family and facing one's life choices and just having the spotlight on you. It is a hard listen because it is, and it was also anxiety producing to record too, and to listen back to and to mix and all of it. But I think we really dialed in with the film of what it was just coursing through Danielle's veins was what this film was. I mean, this score was. And so I was really pleased to kind of stick with that one point of view.
And with that, you had mentioned the klezmer being something that kind of needed to be used in it, like to some extent at least. But other than that, like not having a temp or anything, what was the approach to scoring it, having that pretty blank slate otherwise to work with?
Sure. And so, yeah, I mean, that was an early idea early on of Emma wanting something klezmer influenced, but ultimately these techniques are not related to klezmer music at all. I mean, they're just so that kind of that idea of that, it was certainly an inspiration and something we explored a little bit, but ultimately it just became its own thing. And the approach to scoring it was very, very improvisational. Nothing was written out. Nothing was really thought much ahead. It was very much like pass after pass after pass after pass after reacting to dialogue and visuals, and then a pretty heavy editing pass afterwards, and of removing and adding, and yet another pass after that. But it was really interesting because I was just consistently improvising with those takes. So it was really natural and organic, and there's certainly no sheet music for it. And I would never want to transcribe any of it either. But yeah, it was really natural and just reactive.
Is that something that's normal for you, or was it really just like the nature of this film in particular that called for that improvisational approach?
Yeah, super. I mean, to this extent of kind of 100% improvised was definitely because that was what the film called for. There's certainly always improvisational aspects of each score. I can't think of anything where there wasn't, but there's definitely varying, especially if something's going to be recorded. You obviously need to have a plan of transcribing what you wrote at some point, or, very much writing with the intention of it being very neatly transcribable and orchestrated. So I think, yeah, it's just about what the end game is, and if it's going to be, start and stop in your studio, and if you're sending it off to other people, you have to write in such a way that you can translate it.
I'm curious then to kind of stick on this track for a little bit, because
Sure.
I don't really hear about improvisational approaches that much. I mean, I guess like to the extent that you're sitting on the piano banging out keys to like try to figure out melodies and themes, or if it's like a jazzier score or something and you're playing with the group and seeing what happens. But for this, when you're saying improvisational, is that like you just playing and over and just seeing what happens? How did the improv come about?
So when, like specifically with Shiva Baby, I gave Emma a library of, I don't know, 50, 100, I don't remember how many sounds I recorded, but different techniques on the violin. She knew she wanted something that would punctuate and something sharp. So, immediately staccato and pizzicato and other techniques of Bartok pizzicato. But I also wanted to show her these other gestures that were possible on the violin, that were also very short, and the cello, that were also very short and kind of in that same world of punctuating music. And then I also did kind of longer gestural techniques to kind of give her the whole tour of the instrument of what was possible. And these were all kind of non-melodic gestures. They were just an extended technique sound textures. And then she went through them and kind of chose and highlighted which ones she loved. And so I knew to kind of stay away from vibrato. I knew to kind of stay away from very melodic gestures and to really stay a lot more in the textural kind of non-melodic, even non-tonal textures. And so that, she helped me narrow down what techniques I would be using, and that kind of gave me further parameters. So it kind of guided my improv. I knew I would only be using certain kind of textures, and then it was just pass after pass after pass. I mean, I got probably each scene took like between 10 15 passes and layers of thinking it through, and then again extended editing processes. So it's like liking it to the freedom of thought, writing experiment, and then you go back and you edit it, and that's the final draft of it. I was never thinking that what I was recording would be the final draft. It was just to get these sounds together, and then we were just editing them together afterwards. Ultimately, we just kept pushing it scarier and scarier and more tense and more tense. So there were versions of it where it was a little more playful and a little more fun, but then we kind of peeled those elements away, and it really ended up being more intense.
And as I said before, part of me is not happy that that's how it came up, but like really, I love it. I love listening to something and getting that type of visceral gut reaction of this is just sound at the end of the day. Like it's just sound put together that creates a giant knot in my gut. It's just like so cool when something has that kind of extreme effect.
There was one moment I think that was the most fun, was this it's a long sequence, kind of 3/4 of the way through the film, and on the soundtrack it's called Anxiety Attack. But it's a really, really tonal shift and kind of commitment to this soundscape. But there is a moment where a song is sung diegetically with the actors, and the score kind of starts to coalesce into something more rhythmic and supportive of the song, but yet it's not melodic in any way. So separate from the song, you can't quite hear what it's doing. But what was so satisfying about, and the way it was mixed, and I give huge credit to how it was mixed and how it was sound designed as well. Hunter Burke, who did that, it was just so rewarding to get to kind of support even in an auditory way, the song that was happening on screen, and just that it became so much part of the DNA of the anxiety and the design of that. So I just loved it. I loved doing it.
That's awesome. Shifting gears a little bit to something that's more recently come out and sounds 100% different is your work on the third episode of American Horror Stories, the fairly new, I don't know, is it an anthology spin-off of American Horror Story? I don't know exactly how it's framed, but I think that's right.
Yes.
And so that was cool that in a way it's similar to talking about your EP, where it's something that's very different from at least what I had been accustomed to you doing. I had read the premise of it and then had an idea in my head of, okay, this is what it might sound like, and then you watch it and it's a completely different, far more electronic-based sound. It's always fun to hear those different approaches and those different skill sets that a composer has.
Sure, yeah. I mean, that was a total blast and a real thrill and honor to be part of that team, and to work within that genre and that family of creators. And so that was really fun. And, not to spoil any of the content of the episode, but it's very much about the influence of a film on those who watch it, both in the past and present. And so it was very important to have a very strong melody that was consistently weaving its way and worming its way into the characters' heads, and also being diegetic on the film too. So that was really, really fun. And working with electronics is also really rewarding and interesting in terms of the width of effects and changing and modulation that can happen, and how you can start with a single sine wave and end up with something you would never be able to pinpoint. That's very, very exciting about that world as well. And again, it's all about just editing and sound shaping, and it's not that different from writing with acoustic instruments. It's another source, and like arranging principles are still the same in terms of high and low frequencies, and how to prevent mud, and how to the elevation of a melody because it's most present, or it's the brightest sound, or it's kind of these same traditional techniques you learn with orchestral composition are really applicable to electronic music too, just in terms of how you think about sound and how we hear things. So I love that palette as well. And that project was very, very fun and all about energy and melody.
That's a really interesting point, because I think a lot of people just hear the sound and generally you're electronic, and I do kind of hate that phrase because it's so absurdly broad, but how electronic music and orchestral acoustic music sounds so different. And so I think there's an inherent belief that everything about them has to be different, right? So it's interesting for you to say that, yeah, they're just different sounds. At the end of the day, they work the same. All the principles are the same. So it's cool to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's just all about, the certain principles of mixing. Of course, it's very different mixing an acoustic ensemble it would be to an all electronic score. But the principles of how a piece of music comes together and the roles of each sound, and a motor, a bass, a melody, a pad, all of these things they cross between both genres. So yeah, they're very, very different worlds, and very, very different traditions. But I don't think composers have to box themselves in just because they're not necessarily, because they're more literate in one than the other. I think there are a lot of similarities in terms of how to approach it.
Well, it's the same thing as you might be more literate on a piano than on a flute, but it doesn't mean you're not going to use flutes.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, not everyone thinks that way. I think that's more a symptom of fans than actual composers. But it's always a little annoying to see.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
I did actually find it really interesting that you were able to have melodies and motifs weaving their way through the entire time, because I think the episode's 42 minutes, kind of that standard hour-long TV form. That's not a lot of time to work with recurring melodies and themes. And so how did you manage to fit that all in?
Sure. So there was, there were there are motifs for certain characters and certain themes and, narrative themes. And so, that's how it grows. Again, it's like yes, it's only 40 minutes or 50 minutes, but that's 3/4 of a feature film. And, a lot can be done in that time. It was mainly attached to character. And so, certain, and I, again, not wanting to give away too much of the episode, but, the creator of the film had his own theme. The film had its own theme. The effect of the film had its own theme. And this kind of reuses of the themes also were narratively related. So it's kind of, a traditional technique of just recurring thematic material when it's tied to a certain element. So it happened pretty seamlessly with this episode, I would say. And yes, like the thematic range, I wasn't working with 10 different themes or 12 different themes or trying to, there's certain times when if there's too many iterations or the music there's just too much content, you kind of lose the effect of thematic recurrence, right? And so it's kind of important to keep it simple and refined so you can feel that effect of a theme.
And again, especially when something's 40 minutes and it isn't wall-to-wall sound, if you have 10 themes, it's like, how do they even go in there?
Exactly. Right.
That makes sense. I'll stick with your path and not try to spill anything either, but like the premise of this is watching a film that supposedly drives the viewers crazy. You get that in like the first 5 minutes. So I'm not spoiling anything. With that as the premise, like, did that give a particular pressure to like try to also create something that's gonna be really scary or have a really visceral effect? Or did you like, well, that's just like the plot device. I'm gonna not ignore it, but like keep going and approach it as you would otherwise?
Sure. So part of it was calling back to older films like The Exorcist, of using kind of subliminal images and sound to trigger kind of involuntary responses in the viewers. So it was certainly part of the genesis of those themes. I also knew that it was going to be, very heavily and beautifully sound designed. So I knew that a lot of these elements were also going to be being in the sound design realm. And so what became more important with the music as we went along was it being more of an earworm type of repetition and a melody that continued to evolve and work its way into the episode and into the ears of the viewers, etc. So yeah, it was more so kind of the repetitive exposure of it versus certain subliminal textures that I was adding, where that did kind of come more through in the sound design. You're also working as a composer, you are working with a team. So it's not just your music that's playing, it's also the sound design, it's the dialogue. You can't be doing and lifting all of those weights at the same time. So kind of, and it's nice to kind of work with or be in communication with what the sound team is going to be doing, because you have to make sure that you're weaving and creating your music in a way that isn't going to make it feel like it's oversaturated with what the sound designers are trying to do. And they're all kind of complementing a singular vision. And so in this case, it was very much more about the music being the earworm and the hypnotizing melody versus the sound design that was much more about the horror of it.
Yeah. And so is that something that you basically knew almost right off the bat from being in communication with the sound team, or is that something that developed over time?
That was a directive and kind of a creative decision that was made, pretty early on, about these certain elements, these certain frequencies, these certain devices are probably going to be taken by, that they're going to be explored with more on the sound side, and that this is what we need from the music. In other scenarios, I've also worked very closely with a sound designer. So they, I'll be sending my music back and forth. On a feature, you generally have a little bit more time. The TV timeline is a bit more compressed. So there wasn't a lot of time to kind of send back and forth and layer in that way with each other. But we knew very much what the other one was going to be doing. So to kind of intentionally make room.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And comparing it to working on features, I mean, you already said that you have less time in TV, and that's just kind of how it goes. Did you really see any other notable differences working between a series or an episode and a feature, or is it really just like a standalone episode like this is, like you said, really just one half of a feature-length film?
Like the mechanics of how they're made and the timelines of the finishing process are different, so you kind of have to work in a different way in some ways. But generally they're the same. The approach is the same. In a longer standing series where, you have 10 episodes or 5 episodes or 25 episodes, the arc is much larger. So you know that your thematic material can kind of grow in a much slower way, in a certain way. Whereas, in a feature, you have 90 minutes to do what you're going to do. And so in a way, it's a much more accelerated growth of your themes, and it's closed at the end. Whereas episodic television it's the drive-in for American Horror Stories, that was its own kind of independent episode. It didn't continue into the next.
Right.
And so in that way, it was kind of like a feature film. But when you are working on TV, the end of the episode isn't the end of the story. And so and not having, in a way, your music is not, starting, peaking, and concluding in the same way it would with a film. So it's just a kind of a slower burn approach in terms of how you're composing.
That's actually really interesting, and it's not something that I really thought of, that you have all this room to kind of build themes and have them evolve and, evolve with as the characters do and as the plot does. But I guess one aspect that I'm curious about now is like a showrunner or the writers know where all of that's going to go, both within a season and assuming a show's not going to get canceled. If they have in their minds it's going to be 5 seasons long, like they broadly know what's going to happen across those. But you as the composer don't. So are you ever thinking ahead, like trying to predict what might happen or where a theme might go depending on how the scripts are going to end up, or you're still just building as it goes?
Yeah, I mean, so for instance, I'm not sure if I know of a composer who's been given scripts for multiple seasons, but generally you're given outlines or ideas, if not the scripts, for a whole season. So you understand where things are going narratively. And I'm working on something right now where I know how the theme needs to evolve, devolve, based on what I know is going to happen. But yes, so generally you can have these ideas pre-production of how something will evolve, but ultimately it's just changes when your picture is in your hands. But yeah, having that insight into with an outline or with episode summaries or the script itself, it is helpful and insightful to be able to at least vaguely map out how these themes will evolve.
Okay, that's interesting. And yeah, because most of the people that I have on here are composing for media broadly, but we always focus on film. So I'm always curious to learn more about shows or composing for documentaries or composing for video games, which is something that is, in my mind, a whole different world that I don't know anything about. So
sure, and
it's
neither
a lot of
do
fun
I.
to hear about it. So I think you're at a really interesting point in your career now, like especially in the last, it feels like 6 months, where you can look at your IMDb, for instance, and the first, I don't know, 50 entries, it's just this barrage of short films. It's something that's really common with a lot of composers, especially now. Like, you just work your butt off composing every short that comes your way. But then, like, Shiva Baby comes out earlier this year, and yeah, obviously it's not, a blockbuster or anything, but it had a lot of critical acclaim, real indie darling, and then Rebel Hearts just came out. Then you have this episode of American Horror Stories, which, like, American Horror Stories are massive properties. Like, how are you feeling about things? I mean, this last several months has been crazy trajectory. Are you looking to, like, keep it going, or are you hoping to stay more in a indie, low mid-budget realm? Where are you seeing things?
So I would say, like, this entire trajectory, my entire, professional career at this point has just been one step in front of the other. And I think, this industry does work in unexpected ways. Like, you just never know when something will hit or when something will resonate or, when a certain thing will become an indie darling. Like, these things, it's very hard to predict it all. And so of course, I would say I just have a very open mind, and it's one foot in front of the other. And I've been so grateful for all of these amazing projects that I've been working on, and that, like, even in the midst of a pandemic, we've been able to get them out the door. And I've been really excited. And I'm very proud too that my work is spanning from narrative to documentary to indie to studio. And it's been really, those all have those they're rewarding aspects of them. So I would say I'd just love to keep my feet in those worlds and to keep, of course, to keep going up. But I'm excited by the trajectory, and I also want to stay very humble about what comes next and to just be very grateful for the path that I'm on. So again, just one foot in front of the other. But I'm very proud and very excited, and it's a really exciting time. I'm feeling very inspired.
Cool. And I don't know if it's if you're able to talk about anything that you have coming up on the horizon, or if it's still too early, if everything is hush hush at the moment.
Unfortunately, it is, but I'm working on a series and a couple more features. So again, I'm very excited that different media and different approaches to media. So it's moving along, and I'm very excited.
Cool. I'm excited too. I feel like I've been watching your career growing, but at the same time, like it's only been since like April. But it's cool to see. It's cool to see like someone continue to grow, to continue to have great opportunities and great things coming out. And then one of the nice things of streaming services, like there's a whole bunch of negatives. One positive to something like Spotify is finding out about your more recent things and then going and listening to what's come before.
Sure.
Getting like a broader picture built of your palette and where it might reach out to next.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a wild ride. I'm super happy to be on it, and yeah.
Awesome. Well, I didn't even plan for that, but like I think that's a perfect note to wrap things up and end them on.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, great to talk with you.
Yeah, and thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it. I'm glad that we were able to finally get something scheduled after a few bumps in the road and me forgetting when we had things scheduled in the first place.
It's all good. It is all good. Thanks for being flexible, too.